It's been a while since I've done this. All right. Anyways, welcome back to the Scotty No Show. It's been, interestingly enough, about a year since we last did something. And our first guest on the relaunching of this show is Coach Allan Bertram. How you doing, Coach?
I'm doing good, and I'm very privileged and honored to be your first guest back after a little hiatus, Scotty.
Oh yeah, so sometimes you have to recharge those batteries, You have to figure out whether or not it's something you want to do, and you just gotta take some time for yourself.
100% agree, and I think so many times in today's world that not many people are doing that for themselves from time to time. And I think self-care and making sure that you are in the right place at the right time where you need to be is the most important part of being who you are. And so I commend you for what you do. And I've always had a ton of respect and an immense amount of respect for you and your passion around athletes and athletics in Central South Dakota. And you were such a great advocate for so many for such a long period of time, and I know you continue to be that way in so many different methods.
Oh yeah. It's funny you say that. I remembered a thought from way back when I was in like the fourth grade. I wrote a letter to EA Sports asking for a high school football video game. I completely forgot about that until like today.
That's pretty cool, actually a good idea. Could you imagine the fun you would have as a South Dakota person who loves sports in South Dakota, being able to match up different high school football teams from even the past, playing against current teams and all that? That'd be kind of cool, buddy.
Oh yeah. Um Anyways, you since the last time I we had you on the show, you were at Rapid City Central last time you were on the show. Now you're at Mount Marty. Um what's that transition been like to go from high school coach to college coach?
It's been a lot of fun. I've probably, obviously coaching for over 20 years now. Probably the most fun I've ever had coaching the sport of basketball. To be able to be around young adults who love the game. Everybody who is on the team purely loves playing and is very passionate about it. And just to be able to be around great student athletes. We're blessed to have some phenomenal young ladies here at Mount Marty who not only love playing the game of basketball, but are very, very driven academically and what they want to do career wise. And so all that's just extremely important, and it's awesome to be around all the time.
What's the difference between like the main difference you would say between high school and college?
I think there's many factors, obviously. I think for people who want to become college players, I think one of the biggest and most definite differences is the speed and athleticism and physicality of the game. It's so much more physical. There's a lot of kids who can be really good high school players that just may not be a very good college player because of lack of aggression. And the want to be able to grow. I think the mental part is very hard when it comes for our young people making that step up. Most kids are used to being the best player at their high school for 4 years. And then all of a sudden they're in a gym and everybody in the gym was their school's best player. And so you have to relearn how to fight for what you want. You have to learn how to accept that there's areas that you're probably not as good at that you thought you were. And then you really have to hone in on what you got to do to get better. And that takes a lot of work. Especially when you come from a situation where a lot of times you didn't think you had to work on a whole lot of things because things were pretty easy. I tell a lot of people at college level, the game of basketball will get hard for you at some point. And that's when you really, really learn on whether or not you truly love the game or you just like it. And the kids who actually do well at the college level are the ones who are very passionate about growth and want to really put the time in to get better in the areas that they are lacking in or the areas that they really need to improve in.
One thing I noticed just looking at your roster, you have a lot of in-state talent. Is that like a focus, like a goal is to kind of make sure that these kids are able to stay closer to home than to like branch out to like Nebraska or Iowa or other states like that?
It's very important to me. I mean, obviously being like you, I'm a South Dakota boy, and I know how good our athletes are here in South Dakota. I feel girls basketball in South Dakota is very, very good. And we have a lot of young ladies who want to play college basketball. And so for me, I don't think we have to go out and try to find kids all over the map. I think that we've got a lot of great ingrown home talent right here. And so my focus is always to try to make sure that we have as many kids from our state here on our roster. And I really try to work really hard to get a lot of West River kids, Scotty. It's really important for me. I think they're a lot of times our West River athletes are overlooked just because of where they're at geographically, and they don't maybe have the same type of media coverage. But we've got some really good players, West River, that can play at the next level. And so, if you look at our roster, you see a lot of West River athletes. You see a lot of athletes just from South Dakota in general.
Oh yeah. And obviously Mount Marty, for those that may not know, because Mount Marty's kind of a smaller school, um, they're in Yankton. What's the city of Yankton like? Because I personally I love it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. Obviously located right on the Missouri River, so a lot like what you get in Pierre. There's so many recreational things to do here in Yankton in regards to off the campus. It's a city of about 15,000 people, so there's a lot of all your amenities that you really want are here. But the great outdoors is beautiful here in Yankton, and so it's a nice place to live. It's a great community. The support of the programs here are really, really good. Yankton is a sports town, and so they really love their athletics here. It's a great situation for everybody here on our campus here at Mount Marty.
Um, what what like are they division like NAIA? Is that what it is?
Yes, we're NAI, and there's about 300 and some teams in the NAI across the country. So there's a lot of basketball teams across the nation in NAI. And our conference, which is the GPAC conference, is probably the best conference in the country. Most years, 4 or 5 of our teams in the women's side of things are rated in the top 20 in the nation. And so we've got some of the best players, some of the best teams in the country sitting right here locally within our own conference.
Um, One thing and this is just my personal feelings. I feel like women's basketball in general has gotten much more respect and recognition over the past, I'd say 5 years at least. I don't know what the reasoning behind that truly is. Maybe it's the fact that, there's a lot of good players that have been recognized nationally. The first thing I think of is Paige Beckers at UConn. Um, what do you think has contributed most to the rise of women's college basketball?
Well, I think first of all, the skill level is just off the charts. I think we've got girls who are very dedicated to their craft, and the game is probably a much more pure game than even on the men's side in regards to how the game is played. So it's a fun game to watch. But I really believe, we've broken some stereotypes on the female side of things. I think it's always been an adage that that the men's game was better or more fun to watch. But what's happened is as people started to actually dive in and look at the teams and look at the way that a lot of our young ladies can play, they're realizing that it's great basketball. And so I think it's just breaking stereotypes, number one, and people actually paying attention to what's happening. And, girls like Paige, for example, and Caitlin Clark at Iowa has completely risen the level of what can be done. But there's always been great players out there. It's just that the attention hasn't been focused on that. And so it's been great to see more of a focus on the women's game. And if you walk into any gym on any Wednesday or Saturday and you're watching like a game in our conference in the GPAC, you're going to see great players playing at a very, very high level, and it's fun to watch. And so it has been a cool transformation the last 5, 6 years. And I'm very proud of the public being able to open their eyes a little bit into what is really the women's game is all about.
The main reason why I decided to have you on is unfortunately a week ago today actually Bob Knight passed away. You got the opportunity to meet him. What was that like?
It was pretty cool. I got to actually, Bob came and ran a basketball camp with me. Bob and I ran a camp at the Sanford Pentagon, part of the Legends camps that we put on, that was put on every year. And we that day we had about 400 campers between the two sessions that we did. And a lot of times when you have a celebrity camp like that, the celebrity that's there is just there. They do a lot of shaking of hands and they do a lot of pictures and things like that, but they're not highly engaged with the athletes. The one thing that I came away with, Scotty, was just a much greater appreciation for who Bob Knight was. He wanted to be involved in every drill. He wanted to be able to work personally with the kids. A lot of times for coaches especially, or even players at a high level, they don't relate well when you're working with second and third and fourth grade kids, for example. But he was so heavily involved with every drill, with every kid, correcting kids when they weren't doing things the right way. His level of passion, even at that age, when he was retired from coaching with a bunch of young kids that he didn't know and was never going to see again, was absolutely unbelievable to me. And I just walked away with such a greater appreciation of who Bob Knight is, and not as a coach, but as a man. And I think a lot of times, a lot of bad stereotypes have come out about Bob just because of his actions, sometimes on the court. But Bob was a man who not only loved the game, but truly loved every attribute that led to the game, and that truly is also his players and anybody else involved. One of the things that stuck out the most during that time was even his willingness to sit down and talk about coaching and little intricacies that he wanted to share that would maybe help a person like myself someday as a coach. Most people aren't willing to do that. It's I'm going to come in and do my job, and you can pay me my check, and I'm going to leave. And that's the farthest thing from what happened that day.
Um, you know, the story of Bob Knight, I mean, uh it doesn't necessarily begin in Indiana, but it certainly ends in Indiana. Um, growing up, were you an Indiana fan at all?
I was always a Carolina fan just because of Michael Jordan, but I had a deep amount of respect for Indiana and for Bob Knight. Obviously all the great players that went through his program, and anytime you have the amount of success that he had, you have to respect it. And so um, I really feel that he is a person that, as a coach, there's always things that you want to take from coaches that can help you, and there's things you want to take from coaches that you don't want to be like as well. But what he brought to the game was much greater than what most people are, the common person is willing to accept. I think those people who are deeply involved in the game of basketball and really know the game of basketball truly appreciate his impact and what he has done for the game. When you talk to people like Coach Krzyzewski and some of the greatest coaches of all time, they'll tell you, Coach K will flat out say, and he said it many times, the impact that Bob Knight had on him, and that he wouldn't be the coach that he was if it wasn't for Bob Knight. And so I just feel that um, he has a lot of greatness, and he completely impacted the game of basketball in so many great ways.
It's interesting that you bring up Coach K because uh well, a little historical background. Bob Knight, he played at Ohio State. He played on that 1960 championship team with Jerry Lucas and John Havlicek. He was mainly a bench player on the team. But then he went and he ended up coaching at Army. Um, and he got his first coaching job at Army at 24 years old. That's insane to think about. And while he was at Army, he coached Coach K.
Yes.
Um, and then you talk about the 76 perfect team. with Win Buckner and Kent Benson and all those players. And then 81 he had Isaiah. And then 87 was with Steve Alford. Um, all of these are good players. And one thing that I noticed in just watching these games and watching some of the things I watched is um, Coach Knight seemed to get the best out of all of these players, but individually they may not like. Let me try and formulate this thought here. I think Coach Knight could get a good player to become a great team player just based off of his offense and that motion offense that he ran. Describe what that motion offense was like.
Well, if you really dig deep into what they ran and how they ran it, it was really a selfless situation in regards to the way they ran their motion. It wasn't predicated on any one player. It allowed people to be free within the offense, but also with a lot of discipline in regards to how they played. We all know how great Isaiah Thomas was, for example, and he was an unbelievable collegiate and NBA player, one of the best point guards of all time. But even in that system, it allowed the other players around Isaiah to be great. He wasn't pigeonholed. It had been easy to give Isaiah the ball and have him shoot 30 times a game. A lot like what happens in some of our games today, where it's all about the best player. I really felt what it did was it empowered his players. And when you talk to Bob, 90% of Bob's talks were really about defense and the importance of playing defense. And it's really hard to get kids to really buy into play defensively as a unit if they don't feel they're involved offensively. It's easy to tell a kid, we want you to be a stopper and we want you to be a great defender. But if he doesn't feel he's going to touch the ball or be a part of the offense, it's hard to keep that kid motivated. And I really feel that's the best part of what Bob did offensively was everybody on the team felt they were involved offensively. And that way it made it easier for him to put down those expectations of everybody defending. And so even Steve Alford, who probably was one of the greatest college shooters of all time, I mean, the guy was a phenomenal shooter. Bob held him to the very high standards on what he was going to do on the defensive end of the floor. And that doesn't happen a lot in today's game. If you're a great offensive player, a lot of times coaches will let that person slide just a little bit on that end because they know what he brings to the table offensively. But I think that's the greatest thing what Bob did was he treated all of his players equally. He had the same standards of expectations for everybody, and regardless of who you were. And I think that empowers your 12th player just as much as it does your first player. If they know that we all have the same expectations, we're all going to be treated equally, and we've all got the same standards that we have to live by. And I think that's a great testament that all coaches need to learn from, regardless of what your coaching style is. It's so important that everybody's involved and everybody's held and treated in the same manner. And when you do that, it's so much easier to have a team be a team than when you have fragmentations because of how you treat certain kids compared to how you treat others. And so I think that's one of the greatest things that he did. It's crazy how you bring up a topic of motion offense, but that goes into 8 million other areas, Scotty.
Mm.
But truly, that's what the premise of that offense was.
And a lot of what his offense that he ran, which I mean, he kind of really mainly started running that motion offense at Indiana. Part of that was a lot of it inspired by the Princeton offense, from what I
Yes.
read.
Yes.
And you talk about defense. He was a big proponent of man-to-man defense. I I don't think he particularly cared for the 2-3 zone that Jim Boeheim was known
No.
for.
No.
Um, uh,
Well, it's funny too that you say that, but one of the biggest things that's coming back in today's game is the Princeton offense. It's funny how basketball kind of goes in waves and it evolves a little bit, but at the collegiate level, the Princeton offense in the last 2, 3 years has been one of the most sought after offenses to bring back into the game because of the power behind it. And so, again, he was ahead of his time in what he taught and how he taught it. And again, people get way too caught up in his antics and things like that. And I will tell you this, a lot of those antics were who he was, but he also, when you get to really, when even in the day and a half that I got to spend with him, a lot of those were also for show. Um, he started to get that persona, and so when the cameras came on and the lights came on, he became a little bit different person because he was living up to what people thought he was. He's a lot different, Scotty, when you were just sitting down with him and having a Diet Coke and talking about the game of basketball. Way different than what most people would ever think of when it comes to Bobby Knight.
He's he's got a sense of humor from what I
Yes.
was able to see. I read this story, and maybe you know about this story. This is like sometime in the 90s. He announced that he was trying to recruit this guy, Ivan Renko. Here's the thing about Ivan Renko. He doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he was just a player that Bob Knight made up.
Yep.
And there were some people that were like, I've never even heard of this guy. And then there was other people that were like, oh, I've seen game film of that guy.
Yes, absolutely. And what's funny about that whole story, Scotty, is he could do that back then because we weren't in a day of social media and all the things that were going on. And so he simply made up this invisible person that didn't even exist. And because people were so bought into what who he was and all that, I mean, people were literally, there was some sports reporters and other people that were claiming that Ivan Rocco actually existed, and he did not. Where we all know in today's world, the first time, if I was to tell you that I'm recruiting so and so and it was a made up person, you could jump online in 2 seconds, type it in, and realize it doesn't even, Ivan Ranko was probably some guy that was farming potatoes in Serbia that never played basketball before in his life.
Um, and there's also, and Steve Alford talked about this when he was on Dan Patrick last week. There's the story of Alford. I think he was doing like a photo shoot for a calendar for like a girl, like a charity at Indiana, and that was like against team rules. And he was suspended, and so he gets on the bus because he didn't know that being suspended meant you couldn't go to the games.
Mhm.
So he gets on the bus, and Coach Knight is greeting every player as they get off the bus. He sees Alford and is like, you have to walk home. So he made Alford walk from the airport back to campus, and eventually the bus driver that had driven them to the airport like saw Alford, was like, "Do you want to ride?"
Picked him up, picked him
Yeah.
up. And this is what people don't get. Steve Alford was his best player.
Oh
And
yeah.
so, like, again, going back to what I said before, we live in a world today where most people are going to turn their eyes to a situation that seems very simple because I don't want to lose a game because this is my best player. But again, the ideals and the values that he adhered to, regardless of who you were. It did not matter. And when you do that to your best player, it sends a message to everybody else on the team that, regardless if it's that rule or any other rule that I have, that's what we live by. And so, again, not many college coaches in today's game would be willing to to stick to that because sometimes winning becomes much more important than actual values.
Um, it's kind of hard, like you've mentioned it a couple of times. It's kind of hard to talk about Bob Knight without talking about some of the negative aspects of him. But he hated Kentucky. I know that much. Um, he actually, there was an incident in 1974 where he kind of popped Joe B. Hall in the head and said that if it got any more serious, he would have sent him into the stands. And then there's also the rivalry with Gene Cady and Purdue,
Yes.
which, and maybe you could talk about this a little bit. I think Indiana Purdue is maybe the second best college basketball rivalry.
Yeah, people don't understand how big of a rivalry that was. I mean, most of our kids in today's world don't even think about it because Indiana and Purdue's been pretty good the last few years, and Indiana's had an uptick, but everybody knows Duke and Carolina and all those in today's world. They don't understand how much those two schools hated each other. And they were both very, very good. And I had the privilege of meeting Gene Katie. It's been about 8, 9 years ago, at the Final Four, and got to meet him and talk to him for a while. And Gene was a lot like Bob Knight. He was very, very strong in his ideals. Yeah, he was a guy that coached with a lot of passion. Some people would say he held his kids to a high level of accountability, and so I think those two really, I think they were very, they didn't like each other, so to speak, on the court because they were so similar. And because of that, their teams were good. You had two coaches that were very passionate and fiery in what they did. And I think they looked at each other as being rivals because they knew, and they were almost looking at each other in the mirror sometimes.
Um, and then, before the transfer portal was even a thing, he had a few transfers, people transfer out of his program. Uh, I know on the 87 team, Ricky Callaway, I believe, transferred from Indiana to later Kansas.
Yep.
And then, from like 97 to 99, he had three players transfer out of Indiana. Jason Collier, Luke Recker, I believe was his name,
Yep.
played at Iowa, which I always remember him as being from Iowa. I do not remember the Indiana years.
Yeah.
I am far too young,
I
I
think he was
noticed.
only in Indiana for a year.
Oh, was he?
Yeah.
Okay. And then of course Neil Reed as well.
Yep.
Um I think he would hate the transfer portal today.
He would, and I always say this too. People make a big deal about that back then, and every player, every player, when it comes to a coach, personality wise, it's not always a great fit. And so, back then, it probably wasn't as heard of. There were still kids transferring back then, no doubt. But when people are leaving a program like Indiana, it gets a little bit more notoriety or media, when it comes to those things. Coach Knight was not, I'm sure, very easy to play for, because of his expectations and his standards and all those things. We all know he coached really, really hard. He coached his kids very, very hard. And so there's a level of that some kids just can't, aren't up to taking. And so I think a lot of the things that get thrown away from that, though, Scotty, is that when you talk to him about how he coached and why he coached the way he coached, it was much bigger than basketball. It wasn't that he wanted not only his kids to be perfect on the basketball court, but he wanted those kids to gain skills that were going to help them in life. The discipline and the ability to make sure that the little things, even though they seem little, how if you don't do little things right in life, they become big things or big problems down the road. And then also just developing some mental toughness. I think a lot of times, and we see that in today's world, where mental toughness is a hard thing. We all go through a lot of very difficult situations in life from time to time, and to be able to get through those situations, you have to have a level of mental toughness to be able to get you through those things. And so I think what he was trying to do was to try to develop those attributes in his athletes. People see it as a basketball thing. But when you really get a chance to talk to him and know his motives and the reason why he was doing what he was doing, it was more life skills that he was trying to implement in his players every single day.
All right, here's a little bit of trivia for you. So before he retired, he was the all-time winningest coach, I believe. Um Now he's fourth in that list. Do you know the three coaches that are ahead of him?
Well, Coach K for sure.
Hmm.
We know that. He's obviously the top of the mountain when it comes to that. A lot of people forget how many wins that Don Meyer had, and Don was right up on that pedestal as well. I would say, Tom Izzo's got to be getting close. on that, but I'm probably off on that. He's probably a little ways away. So let me know, Scotty.
Oh, okay. The other two coaches, you obviously said K, but Boeheim and Roy Williams.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And people don't get like when it comes to longevity, and that's the key to that number. It's like greatness comes when you look at wins and things like that. Greatness comes with longevity, and all those coaches were able not only to have longevity, but most of them longevity at one or two schools. They weren't bouncing around and all that. They were able to get to a school that they really were passionate about, and were able to build that. And so when you look at Roy Williams at Kansas and Carolina and the things he did there, and Boeheim was at Syracuse forever. And then obviously Bobby Knight, not just at Indiana, but people forget what he did at Texas Tech.
Hmm.
When he took that program over, it was in horrendous shape, and he brought them back to relevancy, is what he did. And so he proved at Texas Tech that he could coach. A lot of people knew him for being great, but that's easy to say, well, anybody can win with Isaiah Thomas, anybody can win with Calvin Booth, anybody can win with all these players. Yeah, he went and took over a program that was bad,
Oh
really
yeah.
bad, and got him to NCAA tournaments and making runs and all that kind of stuff from the ground up. And so it just shows you what a great coach he really was.
Oh yeah. I um his my first memories of Coach Knight was when he was at Texas Tech. And you're right. They went from kind of the cellar dwellers of the Big 12 to like top 5 Big 12 behind like
Yeah.
the Kansases and the Texases.
Yep.
And they had a lot of good players as well. And then I remember him as an analyst as well at ESPN. And he was quite animated from time to
Yes.
time. um, but I think he brought a lot of good insight to every broadcast that he had.
I would
Um,
agree. And I said, I would have loved, because in today's world, people love Charles Barkley
mhm.
as an analyst because he's real, right? He there's no fluff. He says what he feels, and a lot of times what he feels is correct. It's just other people aren't willing to say it. Um, I said it would have been so cool to have Bobby back when he was, a little bit younger, and Sprite, at the same time with Charles, and to be able to have those two together talking hoops would have been awesome, because they both would have told you exactly what they were thinking, and 99% of what they thought was probably the right thing. Just most people weren't willing to say it.
and he loved Michael Jordan. I know
Yes,
that much.
he did.
He got to coach him very briefly in the 84 Olympics, I believe.
Yep.
Um, I think to this day he's the only coach to have won an NCAA title, an NIT, Olympic gold medal, and a Pan American gold medal.
I'm sure so. And he was one of the very first people, Bobby was, when he saw Jordan at a young age, to say that's the greatest player I've ever seen. And he was enamored with his not just skill level, but just everything he brought to the game with his tenacity and how he played both ends of the floor, defensively, how he was always locked in. He was a gigantic Jordan fan. And you guys got to remember, Bobby wasn't just about the offensive glamour. So it wasn't all because Jordan could score. It was about all the other factors that we all ended up seeing in the NBA when he was an all defensive player, how many times, along with his MVPs. He loved him because he was a complete player. And so to me, that's probably, of all the people who say who the GOAT is and all that, when Bobby Knight's saying those things, that tells you what a complete player is, because that's what he looked for in his own players.
And you know, I guess just the final synopsis of Coach Knight is I think he meant a whole lot to the game, and he still means a whole lot to the game. Um, and I know for a fact that there's at least a few coaches that I played for that were definitely influenced by him.
Yes. And people like that, we call them legacy makers, because even after they're gone, there's certain attributes of them that carry on forever. You know, you look at what Steve has done, Alfred has done as a head college coach, and the impact he's made on so many young people. Well, that impact that he's made will then turn to those young people who will later on make impact for others. And he was impacted directly because of Bobby Knight. Coach K is the same way. You look at all the people that Coach K has impacted throughout his career, and you look at Coach K's coaching tree and how many people are out there coaching at high levels right now. Well, Coach K's impact was given from Bob Knight, and Coach K passed it on to other people who are now passing it on to others. The impact that somebody like that has is everlasting because it will always be carried on and passed on. And so that's why, you know, a person like Bob Knight is truly he's a legacy maker, is what he is.
And, you know, you talk about legacy, and I would just like to say, you know, as a Duke fan, I, wish, Mike Woodson the best at Indiana as well.
It's always tough in those situations, you know, because even in today, we're 2023, Indiana still held to the standard in which Bob Knight created way back when. And so every team that comes through when they're good is going to be compared to those teams, and you're living up to something. We call it chasing a ghost. A lot of times, you're chasing something that you may not ever be able to catch, but everybody expects you to catch it. And so Mike Woodson's a phenomenal coach. I'll say that first of all, Scotty, great coach. And he's done a good job there already, but that's a tough gig. You look at has gone on at Nebraska and their football program over the years since Tom Osborne has left, and people are just chasing ghosts down there. Like you're when you're good, you're not good enough because you're always comparing yourself to something that happened when they were great. And that's kind of the same thing when you talk Indiana basketball.
All right.